It was one evening that Joseph came with determination to get what he wants by force. He tried to force me. I hit him on his head with a flower vase. He fell to the floor and blood was over everywhere. I couldn't run because their youngest brother Marvelous came back that minute. He called the Ghana police and I was arrested and taken to one of the stations in Accra. After my arrest, I spent days in detention. At this point, I knew I was not going to escape. The saddest part of it was that what life was bringing before me was more than what I could manage. Mr. Victor chose his family over me. He forgot all the promises he made to me after he heard the news that his brother had died in the hospital in Ghana. I became a murderer for the second time. The first one was with my uncle's wife, and I escaped the punishment of the law because of my affair with my uncle. I knew I was not going to escape the current one. The situation was different. I was charged to court. I had no family in Ghana that I could call to help me hire a lawyer. Thank God for Mrs. Teme, a Ghanaian police officer who heard my stories and decided to help me. She didn't do it on her own, but she contacted a woman. Her name was Mrs. Joy. Mrs. Joy was in Nigeria, an advocate for girl, child, and human rights activists. It was Mrs. Joy who helped me with a lawyer to defend me in court. Mrs. Joy tried for me. On the day of the trial, I was told by my lawyer to explain my story before the jury and what led to the situation that brought me to the law courts. As I have been told before, I did everything my lawyer said I should do, but Mr. Victor wanted a death sentence for me at all costs. He forgot everything I told him and his promise for me. Thank God for me that day. The judge was a woman. I pleaded guilty for my offense and I explained that it happened under tight circumstances. It wasn't intentional. The judge termed my offense as self-defense. Hence, instead of a death sentence or life imprisonment, I was sentenced to 4 years imprisonment. It was one of the help I had received in recent times, although I still ended up in prison. I served my jail terms dually. During this period, Mrs. Joy never left me. She would always come around to cheer me up and advise me. Life in Ghana prison was a tough one. I would never wish even my enemy to be in such a situation. Apart from the ill treatment by the warders, there was no provision of good foods for the inmates, improper health care facilities, and bad conditions of those prison rooms. I met a lot of innocent people, and apart from this, inmates, most especially the females, always face sexual abuse from both warders and fellow inmate prisoners. There was no proper organization within the prison system. Life in prison was hell. It wasn't easy, a place I would never want to go again. Years later, I completed my prison terms and Mrs. Joy came to pick me up. Mrs. Joy was my angel during this horrible period. She helped me and took me back to Nigeria. She had no business in Nigeria, but all she wanted was to get justice for me and all I have been through. I and Mrs. Joy arrived in Nigeria safely. Mrs. Joy had a friend in Ikeja, Lagos State. Her friend's name was Dr. Faith. Dr. Faith, Mrs. Joy's childhood friend. She was a medical doctor, a woman in her mid-50s. It was her house we went to. Dr. Faith was a very nice woman. She took me to the hospital where she worked and gave me a proper medication. Life in Dr. Faith's house was like a living paradise. She and Mrs. Joy also promised to get justice for me against my uncle and send me back to school. That is, if I still have interest in education. I couldn't thank them enough, but the sad part of it was that Dr. Faith's husband wasn't alive. He died years back. I do see his photo frame on the wall in the sitting room. Dr. Faith had a son. She called his name Promise. Promise was just 8 years old. Dr. Faith loved the boy so much. She would do anything to make him happy. However, Promise was a cute and smart boy, so everyone liked him. He does call me auntie. A few months later, Promise fell sick. It was not a mere sickness. That period was terrible for everyone. Dr. Faith tried her best to treat him, but it was beyond her powers. She had to take Promise to a specialist hospital for proper care. She almost spent all her salary on the boy. I began to think I had a problem. Why must it be when people are ready to help me that evil things happen to them? I began to think of myself as a witch. I began to think that my case was spiritual. In the same period, Dr. Faith was told to donate blood for the boy because he had lost a lot of blood as a result of the sickness. Dr. Faith donated blood for Promise, but their blood was not a match. I have never heard of that kind of a thing before. How will a mother and a son blood not be a match? The search for a blood donor continued. The donor's blood wasn't a match for the boy. I told Dr. Faith that I would like to donate blood for Promise, but she didn't allow it. It was when the doctor told her that the boy was going to die if action wasn't taken. Then she agreed that I should donate blood. The test was conducted and my blood was a perfect match for the boy. I couldn't believe it. Even Dr. Faith and Mrs. Joy couldn't believe it. After several tests, the results came out to be the same. After I volunteered to donate blood to Promise, my blood matched his own. I was curious, how could that be possible? Even Dr. Faith, who happened to be the mom, her blood wasn't a match for the boy. There was tension between us all in the hospital. Dr. Faith and Mrs. Joy good attitude changed towards me. At that point, they no longer treated me well, the way they used to do again. I felt the usual syndrome I had started again. Like, maybe I was born to be unfortunate. Even with her hatred towards me, she still allowed me to donate blood for the boy because it was his last hope. I became confused and devastated. I was ignorant of everything. The only question that came to my mind was, why do I have to face challenges when people are ready to help me? It was a question without an answer. Promise became fire and was discharged. We came home that day with excitement. Hence, the relationship between me and Dr. Faith changed. She no longer treats me well. I was wondering what could be the issue, but nobody gave me an answer. But was it my fault that my blood was a match for her son? Is there a crime in that? At that point of my life, it seems like a crime. She no longer gives me the care she used to give me. And anytime I tend to play with Promise, she won't allow it. She would call the boy away from my side. We became like a rival in the house. I felt their hatred towards me, so my sadness ignites again. One fateful day, Dr. Faith and Mrs. Joy were talking in the room about how they were going to get rid of someone. I was scared by the statement, even though my name wasn't mentioned. The same day, I got to know that Promise was not Dr. Faith's biological son. She bought Promise with money from one Mrs. Bemisola. Immediately, my brain flashed back to the Mrs. Bemisola that I once lived with, the woman that sold me into prostitution and sold my baby for money too. All this assumption made me believe that I was the one they were preparing to kill. Without spending more than 10 minutes in the house, I ran away from the house. I wandered hopelessly in the streets of Lagos. It got to a point where I had to even beg before I could eat. I started regretting the day I met Mr. Victor. He should have left me alone in Cyprus to continue my prostitution job. Hence, I wanted my son back, but how can I do it without having any backup? They will just waste me for nothing. Their conversation shows that they were ready to do anything to have the boy, so I continued to live in the streets. Life in the streets of Lagos wasn't a pleasant thing. A lot of things happened in the streets of Lagos. The streets consist of people whose dreams have been aborted or destroyed, or those who are orphaned, who struggle to keep up with life. I have seen several how little kids of age 11, 12 snatch pockets, bag and money from people in the streets. Although I wouldn't blame them because it was the choice life gave to them. Apart from all this, the streets are full of unsafe vices such as rape, violence and unrest. It was the same streets where I met Kate. Kate was a lady like me who life pushed to the streets without having a choice. She explained to me how her parents died while she was young and how her uncle claimed her father's properties. She also told me that she would fight with her last breath to regain her father's properties. Our dreams seemed alike. I wanted justice against my uncle, who I hadn't seen for years, and I also wanted to regain my son. I and Kate became friends. We do almost everything together. We wandered the streets of Lagos together. If you have to live in the streets, you have to be tough and strong. So we adapted to those calibious futures. Like one day, I was alone thinking about my life and everything. That was when I remember Mrs. Ajoke, a woman rights activist who lived close to my uncle's house in Ogun State. I stood up like a soldier that day. I rushed down to Miss Kate. I explained to her that I remembered someone who could fight for us and end our struggles. She couldn't believe me. I had to convince her until she believed. We planned to travel down to Ogun State that week in search of Mrs. Ajoke, but there was no money with us. I won't lie to you. That day, we did what the street people do. We picked pockets. We searched someone's purse full of money although we weren't caught. It was the money inside the purse we used to travel down to Ogun State to locate Mrs. Ajoke for help. We got to Ogun State that day. Mrs. Ajoke's house was just few miles away from my uncle's house. Unfortunately for us, we didn't meet Mrs. Ajoke at home. Like, it was when we were about to leave that the gateman informed us that Mrs. Ajoke had relocated away from the area. I tried to ask him where she relocated to, but the gateman wasn't specific. He helped us with her number that day. As we left Ogun State to Lagos, we came back to Lagos that evening without locating Mrs. Ajoke. I saved her number on my Nokia phone after the gateman helped us with it. Hence, I wasn't happy. My instinct told me that Mrs. Ajoke could be my last hope. We returned to the streets of Lagos to continue our usual nasty life, snatching pockets, bags and valuables to survive. It was just what one must do, else you starve to death. I and Kate were at our casual place of fun when we noticed two men. A woman approached us. The next thing I heard from the woman was, "Officers, these are the ladies that snatched my pockets." I was shocked and scared. My heart nearly jumped into my stomach. Could it be another problem for me? I was thinking in my mind, the truth is, we weren't criminal. Hence, what we did that day was very bad. The purse contained a lot of money, a passport and a key. I remembered I kept the passport and the key somewhere safe. We were handcuffed by the police and pushed into the vehicle as they drove us down to Ajegunle Police Headquarters. We were tortured and questioned. At the police station, I didn't lie to them. I confessed I snatched the purse because we needed money to do something. I also revealed that we had spent all the money. When the woman came, she told the police the money wasn't really important to her. The passport and the key inside the purse were what she needed. Although Kate didn't know I kept the passport and key, I didn't inform her. She was surprised when I told them I was going to provide it. I gave them a condition. If she really needs the passport and the key back, she would have to bail us first from the police station so I could go get what she was looking for. Fortunately for us, she agreed. She even paid for our bill by herself yesterday and brought us food and drinks. We were granted bail after spending 2 days behind bars at the police station. It was even the woman who drove us back to where I kept the passport and the key. As I handed it over to her, she was happy. It seems she needed it so badly. After getting her stuff, she spoke to us. She told us her name was Mrs. Grace. She asked us what led us to living this kind of life in the streets of Lagos, as we were very young girls who should have been busy with school or learning a trade. We told her everything that had happened in our lives. She volunteered to help us. She promised to enroll us with her friend so we could learn trade like tailoring, hairdressing, or whichever trade we care to learn. It was a good idea to me, but I wouldn't want to fall victim again. That was not the first time someone would promise me, and it would resort to something else. After several murmuring and silent discussion between I and Kate, she convinced me. She suggested the woman could be the help to us. The relationship between us was so close that there was nothing she would tell me that I wouldn't listen to. We decided to give it a try. We left Ajegunle and we followed Mrs. Grace down to Aleso, Ikeja area of Lagos. She stays alone in her apartment. She was a civil servant. A week later, she started to fulfill her promise by enrolling us to learn hairdressing in Mama B's hair salon. Being an apprentice in Nigeria is not something really easy. It is just like good passing through fire. I and Kate continued our learning with Mama B. Mama B was a strict master. She doesn't take nonsense from anyone. Hence, I never had any issue with her. On Thursday, we were braiding a customer's hair. When a woman came to the shop, she greeted everyone. I looked up. I couldn't believe my eyes. It was Mrs. Ajoke, a woman I have been looking for a very long time. I jumped up with excitement as I hugged her. She doesn't recognize me, but I do. Mama P even gave me a resounding slap for what I did, but Mrs. Ajoke appeared lost. She couldn't remember where she knew me from. It was after I explained myself, telling her where I knew her from and how I have longed for her help all these years. She remembered and greeted me hospitably. Mama B also apologized for slapping me earlier. After Mrs. Ajoke was done plaiting her hair, I followed her to her car to further tell her everything about myself, what my uncle did to me in the years, and about reuniting with my son again. She was emotional. She felt pity for me. She told me she knew my uncle very well. She called him a wayward man. She even told me that many cases and molestation cases have been linked to my uncle in the past, but she was looking for perfect evidence to deal with him. Yes, of course, I would be the perfect evidence. She left that day after giving me her hot mobile number where I can contact her whenever I want to visit her. She gave me her address as well as some amount of money. I had to hid it from Mama B, else she will skin me alive. She doesn't like it when we collect money from her customer. She termed it as begging. I and Kate got home that day. In the evening, we closed around 6 every day. We met Mrs. Grace in the house and told her how I met Mrs. Ajoke at the salon and who she was. Mrs. Grace told us that she was even preparing to ask us some questions concerning our stories we told her before. She was about hiring an activist to open and handle our case, but since I told her how qualified Mrs. Ajoke is, she suggested that I should invite Mrs. Ajoke to her house for dinner so she could discuss it with her. Saturday of that week, I invited Mrs. Ajoke earlier that our guardian wished to meet her. Fortunately for me, she accepted. She visited us that day. She met Mrs. Grace. They discussed together in the sitting room. We weren't there with them. All I could remember was that they talked while we were in the kitchen preparing dinner. We ate dinner together in the night. For you to know how intense their discussion was, Mrs. Ajoke left the house around 10 p.m. that day. I was so happy. Mrs. Grace prepared for church the next day, and her phone rang. It was Mrs. Ajoke's number. I rushed down to give her the phone. She doesn't like it when you listen to her conversation with someone, so I had to leave the spot. But I heard her asking the caller, "Which hospital did you carry her to?" I was curious. I knew something serious was wrong. Who could it be? I asked myself. She came out from the sitting room wearing a sad mood. She said Mrs. Ajoke involved in a car accident. The syndrome has started again. It seems my issues was beyond ordinary. I noticed that whenever anyone tends to help me, something bad will just happen to them. I don't know why it happened that way. I began to think of myself as winch, and at the same time, I was praying that Mrs. Ajoke should not die. She should be safe. Mrs. Grace pulled off her gele and high heel shoe she was putting on. She rushed out of the house. Kate wasn't in the house at the time. Mrs. Grace sent her to get some soup ingredients in the market because Sundays used to be like Christmas in the house. Kate rushed back home and told me that Mrs. Grace asked us to prepare jollof rice and pepper chicken, and we should bring it together with juice to CMD Private Hospital in GRA Ikeja. She asked me what went wrong when she wasn't around. I explained to her that a call came in telling Mrs. Grace that Mrs. Ajoke had a car accident. We were sad with curiosities. We prepared the meal and packed everything Mrs. Grace told us to bring to the hospital in a lunchbox. I and Kate arrived at the hospital. We were delayed outside before they finally let us in. We met Mrs. Grace in the ward. Where Mrs. Ajoke was, she was in coma. She couldn't talk, move or wink. I was terrified. I asked myself why Mrs. Grace instructed us to bring food for someone who was in coma. Different thoughts parade my mind. At the same time, we stayed in the hospital for more than 24 hours and there was no improvement. Mrs. Ajoke didn't even blink or talk or anything. She was just there. It was at this point I started to lose hope. I concluded that I could not see help again. Something spiritual was wrong with me. That was not the first time evil before those that tend to help me. I kept on praying. I didn't even tell Kate anything about it, but I was scared and confused. I was scared for Mrs. Ajoke, and I was also scared for Mrs. Grace. I prayed that I don't end up losing both of them. We didn't go to work for like 3 days. When Mrs. Grace finally told us to go home to rest, I went ahead of Kate. I made sure she didn't track my movements or know where I went to. So many thoughts permeate my mind. I was thinking of running away, but my instincts disagree. All I could remember was that I went to a church. Immediately I stepped into the church premises, this pastor saw a revelation about me. He stopped me immediately. I was so scared. I cried and asked him for help. I knew my case wasn't ordinary. After several drama and plea from the pastor, he finally let me in. He sat on a plastic chair at the edge of the church. It was there the pastor told me he saw a revelation that someone had used sexual intercourse to destroy every fortune I had in me. I couldn't believe my ears. I asked him to come again, and he repeated the same thing 3 times. At this point, I couldn't control my curiosity. I was shivering and crying. Since all the fortune in me has been destroyed, why am I alive then? Which means I am a living dead. I asked the pastor to help me ask the spirit who the person was, because I had slept with a lot of men. Of a truth, it all started from my uncle. He molested me years back and got me pregnant twice. That was the same incident that made me run away from home before I was sold into prostitution, and my son was sold to a rich woman, which I later discovered. Moreover, I was once a prostitute in Cyprus too. I have slept with over 80 men, so who among them stole my destiny or my fortune? I asked the pastor severally. The pastor delayed me for like 20 minutes before he finally sent someone to tell me that I should come the next day. He had a lot of people to attend to. I asked the person whether he had a message for me, but the reply I got was no. I left the church with different thoughts in my mind. I was even thinking suicide. I was hopeless. My destiny had been taken away a long time ago. No wonder I have been able to see a genuine helper. No wonder evil things happen to my helpers. I began to think who could have done such a thing to me, but I couldn't even think of any, because I couldn't count how many men I have slept with. I got home that day and pretended like nothing was wrong with me. I cried that night till daybreak because I was hopeless and weak. Meanwhile, Mrs. Ajoke was still in coma fighting for her life. I got home that day around 7:30 p.m. Kate asked me where I went to. I lied to her that it was Mrs. Grace that sent me on an errand. Kate, being Kate, believed me. I joined her in the kitchen as we prepared the food we ate that night. The following morning, we woke up early and went straight to the hospital because Mrs. Grace had informed us that she would be going to her office that day. We arrived at the hospital. Mrs. Ajoke was still in coma. I even heard the doctor suggesting they transfer her to a specialist hospital because her condition wasn't improving. I blamed myself once again. I already knew everything was happening because of me, because of the syndrome in me. Hence, I was praying to God to deliver me. A few hours after, Mrs. Grace left the hospital for work. I spoke to Kate. I lied to her that Mrs. B, our boss, asked me to come. Kate agreed. I promised to come back as early as possible. I left the hospital and rushed back to the church to see the pastor. When I got to the church, I couldn't see the pastor. I was delayed for more than 2 hours before I was called upon to meet him. Where he used to receive visitors, the pastor told me that immediately after I left the previous day, he saw a revelation that the person responsible for the problems in my life was someone very close to me. In a nutshell, my blood relation. He said the person used girls to renew his wealth weekly. I fell into his net in the past. Mind went straight to my uncle. He was the only family relation who I had intercourse with while I was in his house for the holiday. I wasn't even the only one. He also slept with his only daughter back then. Does that mean he also used his daughter to renew his wealth? Wow, my uncle is a beast. I explained to the pastor how evil things has been happening to all those who helped me. I also told him about Mrs. Ajoke, who was in the coma fighting for her life because of me. I asked the pastor for a way out. The pastor said we should pray, especially for Mrs. Ajoke, that God should bring her back to life. Hence, I have to look for my uncle and locate him. He said my uncle and I must see each other face to face, and that was the only solution he gave me, apart from fasting and prayer, he suggested. I thanked him as I left the church. After spending 3 hours, I went straight to the hospital. On getting to the hospital, I saw everyone smiling, including those who came to see Mrs. Ajoke, her colleague in the office. Yes, God did it. Mrs. Ajoke had started responding to treatment. The doctor confirmed that she was going to be okay. I was so happy. The excitement on our faces made Kate forget about asking me why I stayed long. It was a season and period of jubilation. The excitement on everyone's faces shows that Mrs. Ajoke was a woman loved by everyone, both young and old, male and female. A few hours before evening, she spoke. The first was she mentioned that she was hungry. She needed something to eat. Mrs. Grace was around at the time. She instructed us to go home and prepare toasted bread and rich tea. The doctor suggested that she needs something light, not a strong meal, because her recovery was gradual. We left the hospital and went home to prepare the meal. Hence, my happiness was just 50%. The pastor told me earlier that if I want a solution to my problem, I must locate my uncle. He said my uncle and I must see face to face. On getting home, we cooked the meal she told us to cook. After cooking, we went back to the hospital with the food. On getting to the hospital, it was another story we met. Mrs. Grace told us that, of a truth, Mrs. Ajoke was going to be fine. Hence, the doctor told her when we left that the accident affected Mrs. Ajoke's brain, so she was battling with brain tumor and disorder. She also said Mrs. Ajoke would take time to recover. No wonder she was looking at everyone like a dummy. Her treatment in the hospital continued. Medically, she was responding to treatment, but there was no improvement in her mental condition. She behaved like she doesn't know anyone. Even though that came to check on her from work, she couldn't recognize them. I guess it is something they called memory loss. Hers came with a mental disorder. At times, she would play with food that was being given to her as if she was a kid. All this indicates that she was becoming mad. This time, I was praying, using every chance and opportunity to look for my uncle. But my uncle lives in Ogun State. Although I haven't seen him for years, we resumed back to Mama B's salon to continue our apprenticeship program. Mrs. Grace had explained to her why we had stayed away for quite a long time, and that was because of Mrs. Ajoke. Mrs. Ajoke was one of the top customers. Therefore, Mama B wasn't angry at us. We continued our usual activities. The following day, I and Kate went for a lunch in an eatery in Aluse area. While we were heading back, you won't believe who I saw. It was my uncle. He drove past us with speed, but I still recognized his face so well. He wore his favorite senator dress. I told Kate about who I saw, and Kate suggested that we should trail the car to know where he was driving to. As she suggested, we traced the car for more than 20 minutes before a direction from our motorist made us lose sight of the car. It was painful. I was very angry. Apart from being angry, we knew what was waiting for us when we got to the salon. We had spent more than the lunch time allocated to us. Instead of 30 minutes, we spent more than 1 hour. When we got back to the salon, Kate had successfully sneaked into the salon. As I was about to sneak in, I received a dirty slap from nowhere. Oh, it was Mama B. Her slap used to be very painful. It can make you go there for years. She complained about us spending more than the stipulated time for lunch. The painful thing was that she didn't slap Kate. I was always at the receiving end of blame and pain. A few weeks later, Mrs. Ajoke was discharged from the hospital. This time, she was medically okay. She had started regaining her memory and sanity. As a good woman, Mrs. Grace allowed me to move down to Mrs. Ajoke's apartment so that I could take care of her and assist her recover fully. There were not many choices to be done, except cooking and washing the clothes, which were mainly done by washing machine, and keeping her company. They are the only activities I could do in the house. She was a nice woman, a woman of principle. She doesn't even have a housemaid. Therefore, she has been living alone all this while. If you step into Mrs. Ajoke's apartment, you will know she's a successful woman. The chef in her apartment was filled with honorable awards. After a while, Mrs. Ajoke finally recovered. She became active the way she used to be before. She asked me if I would love to continue living with her, which I agreed without even having a second thought. She liked me a lot. She even begged Mrs. Grace to allow me continue staying with her. Mrs. Grace gave consent to it. She permitted me to permanently stay in Mrs. Ajoke's house. Although Kate remained with Mrs. Grace, the week before Mrs. Ajoke resumed work, she suggested that I put my apprenticeship program in Mama B's place on hold for the meantime. She wanted me to go back to school. I love this idea. I have always wanted to go back to school. I had a dream of becoming a lawyer when I was in secondary school. This dream was still intact before the horrible holiday that made my uncle ruin my life. After several talks with Mrs. Grace and Mama B, they finally agreed that I should go back to school if I still have the interest in education, and I replied to them that I still have an interest in education. On the same note, Kate said she doesn't want to go to school, but she would rather continue and face her apprenticeship program. She said she would not cope if she went back to class. Of a truth, she told me back in the days that she wasn't a bright student when she was in secondary school. They promised to support her aspiration. Most especially, Mrs. Ajoke personally affirmed to me that she would sponsor my education up to the level I want. I thanked her that day. I was so very happy. Things have started falling into places for me. It seems God has started answering my prayers. I reminded Mrs. Ajoke about getting justice against my uncle for all the evil things he did to me when I was still with him, as well as getting my son back from Dr. Faith. Mrs. Ajoke promised me that she would help me with the support I will need to make sure I am fully happy again. I was enrolled in secondary school. I went back to SS1. I wasn't even ashamed of my class. Literally, I was the oldest in the class. Everyone liked me, including the class teacher, Mrs. Faye. Mrs. Faye will always stay behind to give me tutorials. Although I do pay her, her role in my life during this period is something I will never forget. I was enjoying my new school. I was also enjoying peace of mind staying with Mrs. Ajoke. The last time I experienced such was when I was with my parents. That was when they were still alive. That was before I chose to spend the holiday with my uncle. I will never forget that holiday. It changed everything in my life. It ruined my life. It gave room for my uncle to useless my life. It was the same period that my parents died. Who knows if it wasn't my uncle who caused their accident to inherit my father's wealth. My father was a very rich man. When he was alive, the only flaws my parents had back then was carelessness and bad parenting. Our parents loved us to the extent they could buy anything for us, anything that we want, but they failed in the aspect of good parenting. Over the years, I have come to realize that buying gifts, spending money and sending your child to a standard school doesn't make you a good parent. A good parent will always be close to his or her child. A good parent will always care to know what is going on in the life of his or her child. A good parent will also be patient to hear from his or her child. All these attributes make one a good parent because good parenting is beyond giving a birth to a child. It is beyond you being a father or a mother to a child. A father is just a baby daddy and a mother is just a baby mama. What will make you qualified to be called parent is your value impact on the life of your children, your commitments to their emotion, mental and physical well-being. My parents lacked all these attributes while they were alive. If they had cared about us, they may be alive now, because it was when they were coming back from a night party, they had an accident which claimed their lives. They are the party type. Should I say, my parents' mistake put my life in jeopardy. Hence, I have learned a lot from their stories, and I promise to be a good parent to my children later in life. Moreover, Mrs. Ajoke is a typical example of a good parent. Apart from the fact that she was caring, she also found time to have a one-on-one conversation with me. She would ask me what I was going through in school, advise me about guys. It is just that Mrs. Ajoke never had a child of her own till the death of her husband. Those that have children don't know the value of them. My academic activities at the secondary school was going smoothly until I saw a name that matched my surname, Cynthia Badmus. My surname used to be Badmus, and Cynthia was the name of my immediate sister. Lo and behold, it was my sister. I couldn't believe my eyes. She couldn't recognize me again because it's been a long time since we saw each other, but I recognized her very well. I hugged her tightly as tears rolled down my eyes. Mrs. Faye, who noticed that I was crying, called me to ask me what was wrong with me. When I explained my story to her, she cried with me. After reuniting with my immediate sister Cynthia, it was through her I got to reunite with my auntie, my dad's elder sister, and my 2 other siblings. I was very happy when I met them. Although before I ran away from my uncle's house, my auntie was living in Ibadan. I learned she relocates back to Lagos the previous year. My auntie told me how my uncle lied to her and the rest of the family that I deliberately ran away from home after my boyfriend impregnated me. I couldn't believe my uncle could do such a thing. Like, she also told me that they searched everywhere for me but couldn't find me, and they finally concluded that I was dead. I narrated the whole story to my auntie. I started telling her where my uncle defied me and turned me to his toy. I told her how he abused me by taking advantage of my ignorance. I also told her how I ran away from his house after he got me pregnant twice and wanted to risk my life to abort the baby, even when the doctor said it would claim my life. I told her everything I went through in the hands of Mrs. Bemisola and how she sold I and my son out. She opened her mouth in awe. She couldn't believe her ears. I started crying as she consoled me. My auntie was very furious. She was angry at my uncle. Right from time, she doesn't like my uncle, even though they were siblings. The following day, she sent some police officers to arrest my uncle. Fortunately for them, they met him at home. He was arrested that day and taken to the police station. My auntie and Mrs. Ajoke also sent a court invitation to Dr. Fates. It was when Dr. Fates was arrested that she provided where we could relocate Mrs. Bemisola. Mrs. Bemisola was also arrested. My uncle was charged to 6 counts charges for molestation and multiple abuse. Mrs. Bemisola and Dr. Fates were charged with human trafficking and child sales. They were called upon to court some days later. The court opened the case by hearing my side of story. I told them everything. Thank God for other evidence. Each of them has been linked with their offenses for a very long time before that day. The judge pronounced my uncle guilty. She sentenced my uncle to 35 years imprisonment with hard labor. On the other hand, Mrs. Bemisola was sentenced to 25 years imprisonment, while Dr. Fates received a 5 years jail term and her professional certificate was taken away from her. After all this, I finally reunited with my son Promise. I felt inner peace. I was very happy. I was free at last. I continued my education and my auntie took charge of my son and my siblings as I went back to Mrs. Ajoke's house to continue living with her. My auntie and Mrs. Ajoke played an important role in my life. They helped me get back on my feet after all I had been through. Thank God today I am a certified lawyer. I have won over 20 cases, all thanks to God Almighty. The moral lesson of this story is that as a parent, always listen to your child whenever they complain. Never neglect your children. Even if they complain about a family member, listen to them. A lot of children are going through the same thing because their parents refuse to listen or because they have no one to speak up to, no one to believe them whenever they say their story. Even if the thing sounds as if they are saying rubbish, listen to them because in every nonsense, there is always a sense, and always pray to God to give you direction on how you would become a good parent. I would like to know what you learned from this story. Do not forget to subscribe, drop a comment, like and share these videos to your family and loved ones. See you in the next story. Bye.